The first time Karen told me my pond was non-compliant, I thought she was joking. It was early morning, sunlight slicing through the fog above the water, and she marched across the property line holding a clipboard like she was leading a military inspection. "This pond," she said, her chin twitching with righteousness, "violates community standards for reflective surfaces." I blinked. "Reflective surfaces?" "Yes," she said, jabbing her pen toward the still water. Section 4B of the HOA Environmental Reflection Clause. It exceeds the allowed glare limit. I didn't even know there was such a thing. I'd moved into this little patch of country suburbia for peace, quiet, and fishing. The pond had been here longer than the subdivision, long before the HOA imported its plastic fences and beige-colored uniformity. I told her that. She smiled like I'd just confessed to tax fraud. "You'll need to drain it," she said. "Completely. The board voted this morning." I laughed, genuinely thinking it was a prank. She didn't. 2 days later, a bright orange notice appeared on my mailbox. Mandatory water removal order. It cited potential mosquito breeding, hazardous glare, and property aesthetic disruption. It even threatened daily fines until compliance. I called the number listed and got an answering machine that recited legal jargon like a bad AI script. I should have ignored it. But Karen wasn't the ignoring type. She started showing up during her morning power walks, taking photos of the pond, muttering to whoever would listen about unauthorized bodies of water. One afternoon, I caught her measuring the shoreline with a retractable tape. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was documenting environmental risk. Her husband, quiet, gray-haired, perpetually defeated-looking, stood behind her holding a folder labeled HOA compliance logs. I tried reasoning with her. I showed her old county maps proving the pond predated the HOA by at least 2 decades. She didn't care. "We have community standards," she said. "Your property reflects on all of us." She said reflects like it was a curse word. I could have fought it in court, but that would mean months of paperwork and lawyer bills. Instead, I decided to play along, quietly. The following week, I filed a drainage compliance plan with the HOA. It was a simple letter acknowledging their demand and stating my intent to fully cooperate with the drainage order. I even thanked them for their attention to ecological details. Karen was ecstatic. She stopped by to congratulate me on doing the right thing for the neighborhood. She even offered to lend her some pump. That was her mistake. See, what Karen didn't know, and what I quietly confirmed through the county elevation records, was that her McMansion sat exactly 6 feet lower than my pond's overflow channel. Her basement backed directly toward the natural drainage slope that the HOA had ignored when they paved the access road. For years, the pond had acted as a gentle water buffer, soaking up seasonal rains. If I drained it fast enough and directed the flow properly, gravity would handle the rest. So, I spent a few evenings running calculations, setting up hoses, and installing a temporary trench pump. My neighbor, Tyler, who dealt with Karen's nonsense when she tried to fine him for parking his work truck, dropped by to help. We called it Operation Reflection. I bought a few cheap drainage pipes from the hardware store and positioned them discreetly along the fence line. Then I waited for the next HOA inspection day, Saturday morning, when Karen always brought 2 board members for her compliance walks. That morning I greeted them cheerfully. "You wanted the pond drained? Today's the day." I gestured toward the pump setup like a proud contractor. Karen's eyes gleamed. "Excellent," she said. "Finally, we'll bring this place into harmony." One of the board guys, a nervous man named Greg, asked if I had a permit. "Sure," I said. "Filed with the county environmental office. You can call them if you want." That part was technically true. I had filed a notice saying I planned to perform routine water management, which is perfectly legal. I flipped the switch. The pump groaned, coughed, and started sucking water through the hoses. Karen clapped. "Oh, marvelous! It's actually happening," she said. I smiled and nodded, watching the water snake its way downhill behind the fence. The stream followed the natural slope exactly as I'd predicted, straight toward her property. Within an hour, most of the shallow end was dry. Karen left satisfied, declaring she'd report successful compliance to the board. That's when I increased the pump speed. The hose bulged with pressure, spitting out water like a fire hydrant. I adjusted the direction slightly toward the back of her hedge line, where the ground dipped toward her basement egress window. By late afternoon, the pond was half empty, and the flow had carved a small muddy channel leading under her fence. Tyler watched from his porch, trying not to laugh. "You sure this is legal?" he asked. "Absolutely," I said. "I'm draining my property responsibly, as instructed." He grinned. "You're a genius." That evening, dark clouds rolled in. The forecast predicted heavy rain overnight, 3 inches minimum. Perfect timing. The next morning, I woke to the sound of frantic knocking. Karen stood on my porch, soaked to the bone, mascara running down her cheeks. "You need to stop that pump right now," she shrieked. "My basement is flooding." I feigned confusion. "Flooding? From what?" "From your pond," she yelled. "All that water is coming straight into my house." I shrugged. "I followed the HOA order. I drained the pond as instructed. Maybe your property needs better drainage." She was shaking, clutching her phone. "I'm calling the board. You'll pay for this." 10 minutes later, 2 more cars arrived, Greg and another board member. They trudged through the mud to inspect. Greg looked pale when he saw the trench leading from my yard to hers. "This is not ideal," he muttered. "But technically," I said. I complied. The notice didn't specify where the water should go, only that it must be drained completely. He opened his mouth to argue but couldn't find a clause that contradicted me. Karen's husband appeared, drenched and holding a bucket. "The water's halfway up the stairs," he said softly. Karen spun toward me like a storm herself. "You'll be sued," she screamed. "You've destroyed my home." I folded my arms. "Actually, the HOA destroyed your home when they told me to drain a naturally stable pond without consulting an engineer. I just followed orders." The board held an emergency meeting that afternoon. I wasn't invited, but Tyler was. He secretly recorded the chaos. Karen blamed everyone, accusing the HOA of gross negligence and threatening to involve the county inspector. The board panicked, realizing that environmental violation could trigger state fines. By evening, they sent a formal notice voiding the drainage order and instructing me to immediately cease all water removal activities. Too late. The pond was nearly empty, and her basement was a small indoor lake. A week later, county workers showed up with clipboards. They inspected the damage, asked me to describe events, and noted that I'd acted under an HOA directive. When Karen tried to interrupt, one of the inspectors held up a hand. "Ma'am, the topography clearly directs runoff from this property toward yours. It's your association's responsibility to prevent that." She sputtered, pointing at me like I'd committed arson. "He did this intentionally." The inspector smiled faintly. "Then maybe next time, don't order someone to drain a retention pond." The HOA ended up footing the bill for emergency pumping and mold remediation. Karen's basement stayed under construction for months. She petitioned to have me removed from the HOA entirely, claiming I was a malicious influence. The board denied it, too scared of legal exposure. Now, every morning when she passes my yard, she speeds up her walk, pretending not to see me. The pond refilled naturally within weeks, glistening in the sun brighter than ever. Sometimes I catch the reflection of her house in it, warped and shimmering, like karma holding up a mirror. For a few weeks, things were oddly peaceful. The pond refilled with rainwater, the frogs came back, and Karen stayed silent. She didn't glare when driving past, didn't patrol with her clipboard, didn't even post on the neighborhood group chat, which, frankly, scared me more than her yelling ever had. The quiet meant she was plotting. Karen never accepted defeat, she just reloaded. I found out what she was up to one Saturday morning when a county truck pulled up in front of my house. Two men in reflective vests got out, carrying surveying equipment. One waved politely. "Morning, sir. We're here to conduct a waterway compliance inspection." My stomach sank. "On whose request?" I asked. The guy checked his clipboard. "Homeowners Association of Maple Creek Estate. Something about unauthorized reconstruction of a water body." There it was, her next move. Karen had gone over the HOA's head and filed a complaint accusing me of illegally restoring the pond. I watched as they measured the banks, took photos, and muttered about runoff gradients. Then one of them pointed toward Karen's house. "Interesting. That property's still drying out." She was standing in her yard, arms crossed, pretending to garden but obviously eavesdropping. She waved to them like an old friend. "Yes, officers. The flooding came from his pond," she said. They nodded politely but didn't answer. When they left, she gave me that smirk again, the same one she'd worn the morning she ordered the drain. It said, "Round 2, buddy." The county report arrived 2 weeks later. It was technically a notice of evaluation, not a fine, but it warned that if the pond exceeded natural limits or altered drainage patterns, I could face civil penalties. The HOA sent me a follow-up letter demanding temporary suspension of aquatic use, pending investigation. Aquatic use, like I was running a commercial marina. I knew better than to respond emotionally. Instead, I went quiet and did my research. I spent nights reading county zoning ordinances, environmental codes, and HOA charter language. I found something beautiful buried in Section 7A. Any natural water body predating HOA jurisdiction is considered exempt from community alteration regulations. My pond, according to county records, existed since 1989. The HOA formed in 2004. It wasn't just exempt, it was untouchable. But I didn't tell them right away. I wanted them to commit fully to their mistake first. And Karen, ever impatient, made that easy. She started sending me official violation notices again, this time claiming unapproved landscaping around the pond, visual obstruction due to cattails, and unsafe conditions for community aesthetics. She even attached photos taken with timestamps, as if she were building a criminal case. I ignored every single one. Tyler thought I'd lost my mind. "You're not going to fight back?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. "I want her to feel like she's winning." He grinned. "You're terrifying when you get quiet." By midsummer, the board called a hearing. I was required to appear before the HOA's compliance committee, basically Karen, her husband, and 2 reluctant members who'd rather be anywhere else. The meeting took place in the clubhouse, where everything smelled like overbrewed coffee and plastic plants. Karen sat at the head of the table, wearing her favorite yellow blazer, the one she thought made her look official. "Mr. Reed," she said, pretending to read from her papers, "you've repeatedly violated drainage compliance orders, failed to maintain visual harmony, and refused to cooperate with HOA environmental standards." I waited until she finished her little performance, then slid a manila folder across the table. "Before we go any further," I said, "I think you should review the county's land registry for Parcel 71B. Inside were copies of the original subdivision maps, dated and stamped by the county clerk. As you'll see, the pond was recorded decades before the HOA existed. That makes it a protected natural feature." Meaning, I leaned back, watching her eyes dart across the paperwork. "Your board has no legal authority over it." Her jaw tensed. "That can't be right," she snapped. "Our environmental policy clearly states." "Your policy doesn't override state law," I said. "Nor county jurisdiction. And since you've been issuing fines for something outside your authority, that's technically harassment." One of the other board members coughed into his hand. The treasurer, a mild man with nervous eyes, muttered, "We might need to verify this." Karen's face went crimson. "This is manipulation. You're twisting the rules," she shouted. "Actually," I said, "I'm following them. You just never bothered to read the fine print. The meeting ended in awkward silence. I walked out smiling while Karen sat fuming. For about a week, I thought that was the end. Then came the next escalation. A letter from the county. Environmental Impact Review, a citizen complaint investigation. Someone, no prizes for guessing who, had reported that my pond was contaminating local groundwater. I nearly laughed when I read it. The complaint claimed I was disposing of mechanical fluids and fertilizer runoff. I didn't even own fertilizer. But this time, I had leverage. I called the inspector directly. Happy to cooperate, I said. I'll even show you the source of the contamination. When he arrived, I led him around the property line and pointed to the storm drain behind Karen's backyard, where she'd been dumping her pool water all summer. That's chlorinated, I said. Goes straight into the runoff channel. He crouched down, sniffed, and frowned. You're right. That's a violation. The next week, Karen received a county citation for improper disposal of chemical water. She tried to argue it was retaliation. The inspector shrugged and said, "The test results speak for themselves." I heard her screaming through her open window later that day. Of course, that didn't stop her. She called an emergency HOA meeting to propose new rules. Every homeowner with any significant body of standing water must submit a monthly maintenance report. She called it the Water Safety Initiative. It passed by a single vote, hers. That's when I decided to get creative. If she wanted reports, she'd get them. Every month, I filed a detailed, formal aquatic ecology assessment for my pond. 10 pages long, double-spaced, with graphs, species lists, and pH readings. I attached photos of frogs, lilies, and duck. I mailed a copy to every board member and one to the county just for fun. By month 3, the HOA mailbox was drowning in paperwork. Greg, the treasurer, showed up at my door looking exhausted. "Please," he said. "Karen's making us log all of your reports. It's clogging the system." I offered him coffee. "Then maybe she should rescind her initiative." He sighed. "She won't. She thinks if she keeps pushing, you'll slip up." She nearly got her wish, because the next week, my pump malfunctioned. It was old, part of the overflow control system I'd installed years ago. The motor jammed during a heavy rain, and the pond started spilling slightly over the edge. Nothing serious, just a bit of pooling on the grass. But Karen saw it as her golden opportunity. She stormed up with her phone out, filming. "You're flooding the neighborhood again," she shouted. "This is evidence." I calmly walked over, pulled the plug on the pump, and said, "Relax. It's self-contained overflow." But she'd already called the HOA emergency hotline. Within 30 minutes, 2 board members arrived, along with a security guard the HOA hired for community safety. They stood awkwardly as Karen narrated like a reporter. "Here we have Mr. Reed, deliberately overfilling his illegal pond again." Greg looked mortified. "Karen, please, this isn't necessary." "It's absolutely necessary," she barked. "He's been mocking our authority for months." That was the moment something inside me clicked. She wasn't doing this for order or community pride. She was addicted to control. She needed an enemy to feel relevant. And if that's what she wanted, someone to challenge her, someone who wouldn't roll over, then fine. She'd get a rival she'd never forget. That night, I drafted my counterstrike. I pulled together all her false violation notices, the drainage order, her emails, even screenshots from the HOA chat where she called me that pond lunatic. Then I added the county's citation against her for pool dumping. The packet went to a property attorney I knew from work. Within a week, he'd sent the HOA a cease and desist notice for harassment and defamation. The effect was nuclear. Karen panicked. The board froze. Greg called me personally to apologize, saying, "We never approved that letter campaign." She acted alone. He offered to waive all pending fines if I dropped the complaint. I told him I'd consider it, if they officially rescinded every HOA restriction related to water management. He agreed on the spot. Karen showed up the next morning, shaking with fury. "You think you've won?" she hissed. I smiled. "No," I said. "I just stopped playing your game." But the truth was, she wasn't done, and neither was I. Because 2 weeks later, her basement flooded again. Only this time, it wasn't from my pond. It was from her own broken sump pump, short-circuited by the runoff she'd been channeling away from her pool. She blamed me anyway. And that's when I realized, if she wanted to start another war, I'd make sure this one ended permanently, with paperwork, not water. After the county and the HOA had poked inside, the neighborhood split into camps. The pond people and the paper people. The pond people liked mud under their nails and the sound of frogs. The paper people preferred pristine lawns and committee minutes with lots of signatures. I belonged to the first group, Karen to the second. That division is important because fights like ours aren't fought on facts alone. They're fought on optics, ritual, and the slow accumulation of allies. Karen reacted by weaponizing charm. She hosted community safety barbecues, smiling while sliding printed lists across tables titled Top 10 Reasons Ponds Are Bad. Her husband tended the grill but watched my house like it was a theater. I went to one of those barbecues mostly to listen. She cornered me while a guitar player strummed poorly and said, low and urgent, "We need signatures for a municipal permit amendment." She made it sound like civic duty. Neighbors signed without reading. At the next board meeting, the amendment passed. A temporary municipal permit requirement for private water features, with emergency fines allowed during the review. It was a small change with big teeth. Greg shepherded the motion through while barely looking anyone in the eye. That's how rules get made, by papering over discomfort with procedural authority. I decided to flood them with the one thing Karen loved and feared: paperwork. I created the Pond Archive, a binder-laden campaign of boring comprehensiveness. Old aerials, property deeds, soil tests, water quality logs, species lists, maintenance receipts. Every document that showed the pond's history and benign stewardship. I mailed neat packets to every board member and the county. The archive was tedious, precise, and legally solid. It stalled their momentum. Greg muttered about administrative burden. Neighbors who relied on his calm began to look unconvinced. She escalated by shifting tactics. When logic slowed progress, she turned to optics. She started posting glossy flyers on the community board with a dawn photo of my pond labeled community hazard. Someone even affixed a laminated brochure to my mailbox. The flyers read like an op-ed and landed like a wedge. People who'd waved hello began to cross the street. Then, one night, my mailbox was ripped open and a single, unsigned card left inside. "We are aware." The tone was bureaucratic and threatening. It wasn't enough to file notices anymore. Someone was cultivating an atmosphere of surveillance. Tyler warned me there'd been a late-night gathering at the clubhouse called by Karen's allies. Cars lined the street the next morning like a funeral procession. Her timing was surgical. The HOA announced a moratorium on recreational use of private water features pending review. It forbade swimming, boating, and any recreational activity. Technically neutral, politically devastating. The moratorium landed in the Neighborhood Digest just days before we planned a small family cookout by the pond for my wife's birthday. We kept the gathering low-key: hot dogs, a guitar, a few kids splashing at the shallow edge. Karen arrived with 2 board members, all smiling the way predators do when the prey still twitches. "We must ask everyone to leave the water immediately," she pronounced, voice calibrated for authority. People complied, confused and embarrassed. My brother, who'd driven 4 hours, left early, muttering about petty tyrants. Then something unexpected happened. Across the fence, Mrs. Dunlop went into sudden labor. She screamed for help. For a moment, all the theatrics dissolved. Karen transformed from beaming bureaucrat into a frantic human being. She called an ambulance, directed neighbors to clear a path, and handed out coat. The paramedics arrived and sped the woman to hospital. That night, a healthy baby boy was born. Karen told the story afterward as proof of foresight. The moratorium had established a chain of command that allowed a rapid, liability-free response. Praise circulated. People began to think the rules she pushed were reasonable. She'd turned a crisis into political capital. I hated it, not because a baby was born, but because a human event had been co-opted into leverage. Her supporters multiplied. The pond people's small victories in paperwork no longer mattered against the emotional narrative she'd constructed. If she could manufacture virtue, I needed to manufacture transparency. So I shifted direction. Instead of more legal memos, I hosted small, tangible events: a water quality demonstration, a frog counting evening for kids, a fence repair morning where neighbors brought tools and coffee. No speeches, no petitions. Just practical, hands-on things people could experience. I invited Greg under the pretense of showing how harmless the pond was. I invited Tyler's cousin, who ran a local conservation group. Little by little, people who'd been hesitant started showing up. They brought folding chairs, curiosity, and the kind of silent approval that doesn't require a Facebook post. Meanwhile, Karen tightened her rulebook. She proposed symbolic fines and levied one against me for recreational use during moratorium. It was a tiny amount, pocket change, but principle mattered in small towns. I paid the fine and filed the receipt into the pond archive under a stamped label, paid under protest, see county exemption. I wanted the paper trail to show my restraint. I wanted the files to speak for me if the story did not. But stories move hearts faster than files move courts. Karen's narrative resonated. Vigilant protector avoids disaster. My quiet evidence stacked against her loud virtue. Still, the gatherings were building a different kind of momentum, a loose coalition of gardeners, fishers, parents who liked wildness. They weren't eloquent spokespeople, but they were present, and presence matters more than speeches. Her barbecues lost some spark. People who'd previously accepted her notice packets now asked practical questions about water plants and amphibian habitat. She replied with flyer counters and more glossy brochures. When logic failed, she doubled down on spectacle. One afternoon she organized a staged pond cleanup with volunteers in matching vests. They posed for photos with trash bags and triumphant smiles, which she then posted to the neighborhood feed with a caption about responsibility. It was performative, but effective. People liked action when it came in coordinated, Instagram-ready packages. We continued to move in parallel. She with her curated imagery and staged virtue, I with gatherings that were small and sincere. The pond archive thickened. My mailbox occasionally contained anonymous threats, and sometimes a neighbor would avert their eyes. More often, a folding chair would appear by the water, or a child would arrive to count tadpoles. Little by little, ordinary gestures stitched together a quiet resistance. I learned another truth. Small towns resolve disputes not only by rules but by relationship. Paper can slow her, and people can erode the power of spectacle. Neither method alone would win, together they might. So I doubled down on both. Files organized on my desk and friendly afternoons by the water, preparing for whatever came next. Autumn arrived quietly. Leaves mirrored the color of rust along the pond's edge, and the air began to smell like damp wood and old promises. The peace lasted about a week before Karen's next move landed, a certified envelope from a law firm 2 towns over. The letterhead gleamed with embossed gold, Henderson and Barlow, attorneys at HOA law. The document alleged ongoing community endangerment through willful maintenance of an unregulated body of water and threatened a civil injunction unless I ceased all activities associated with the pond. I read it twice, then laughed hard enough to scare a duck. It was technically nonsense, but I knew the point wasn't legality, it was intimidation. Karen had finally gone professional. Tyler stopped by that evening with 2 coffees. She hired lawyers now, he said. Guess you hit a nerve. He looked at the letter. They're bluffing. They'd need a court order and environmental proof. Still, that's gonna rattle the neighbors. He was right. The next few days, people started avoiding me again. They didn't wave, they didn't linger near the fence. The letter worked, not in court but in perception. Karen weaponized paperwork as theater. She didn't need to win legally. She just had to look official long enough to make me look guilty. So I flipped the script. I drafted my own legal-looking letterhead, Maple Creek Pond Preservation Council. It wasn't a real council, but the name sounded bureaucratic enough to confuse her. I created a seal using my home printer and a rubber stamp. Then I mailed a polite, authoritative letter to the HOA stating that, due to pending environmental classification, all external interference with the pond would be considered obstruction of ecological study. It was absurd, but the board didn't know that. Bureaucrats fear paperwork like mortals fear lightning. Within days, Greg sent an email asking for clarification. Karen, of course, demanded proof of my council's credentials. I replied with a single line. Please refer to our founding charter under Section 7A Exemption Statute, 1989. Which was, technically, the county clause that had already proven them powerless. For 2 weeks, silence. Then Karen resurfaced with a new obsession: mosquito control. She claimed my pond was a vector for West Nile virus, and that the HOA had a moral duty to treat it. I caught her sneaking into my yard at dusk with a flashlight and a little spray bottle. I asked what she was doing. Larvicide application, she said, straight-faced. Board approved. Approved by who? I asked. Myself and 2 others, she replied. Majority vote. That night I installed cameras. 2 days later, the footage captured her pouring something into the water at dawn. I checked the label the next morning: pool shock chlorine tablet. I didn't even need to test the water to know what would happen. Every frog, every fish vanished within 24 hours. The pond turned eerily still. I wasn't angry at first. I was stunned. She'd crossed from harassment into environmental vandalism. I filed a report with the county environmental office, attaching the video. The inspector I'd worked with before came back, frowning at the site. This is bad, he said. Really bad. Chlorine levels are through the roof. He took samples, logged photos, and promised follow-up. Karen tried to intercept him on the way out, pretending to be the concerned citizen who discovered the contamination. He let her talk, then handed her a copy of the citation, addressed to Homeowners Association of Maple Creek Estates, Environmental Negligence. That night, I heard shouting through the thin autumn air. Karen and her husband were arguing on their back porch. Words like liability, insurance, and evidence carried clearly. For the first time, I felt a little pity for him. He'd married into a war he didn't sign up for. 2 days later, a new letter arrived, this time from the HOA's lawyer, apologizing. The board was unaware of any member's unilateral actions. It read, "We disavow unauthorized interference." They even offered to fund pond restoration. I accepted the check but used it strategically. Half went to cleaning, half went to signage. Within a week, I installed 2 large wooden boards beside the water. Protected Natural Habitat County Oversight Zone. Trespassing prohibited. Cameras active. Beneath that, a small placard, in memory of the wildlife lost to negligence. Neighbors noticed. Some even came over to ask questions. I explained what happened calmly, without bitterness, just the facts. When people see patience instead of rage, they start to reconsider who the villain really is. Karen stopped coming outside for a while. Then, in mid-November, the rains came, heavy, relentless. The water level rose quickly, spilling over the rocks. My drainage system handled most of it, but the overflow channel followed the same slope as always, straight toward Karen's basement. The irony wasn't lost on me. The next morning, she showed up in a raincoat, yelling through the fence. "Turn it off," she screamed. "You're flooding us again." "It's rain, Karen," I said. "Not a pump." She jabbed a finger toward my property. "You built that trench to funnel water. The same trench your HOA ordered me to dig when you made me drain the pond," I reminded her. She froze. This is your own design. Her husband appeared behind her, pale and resigned. Karen, come inside, he said quietly. She didn't. She stood in the rain, trembling with fury as water dripped from her hair. That night, her sump pump finally gave out. She called an emergency plumber, who worked till midnight trying to save their basement. The next day, I saw her sitting on the porch steps, staring blankly at the puddled yard. No shouting, no clipboard, just silence. The county inspector returned a week later to confirm the chlorine cleanup. He looked at the repaired pond, now refilling naturally, and smiled. You know, he said, if you applied for an official conservation status, the county would maintain oversight permanently. HOA couldn't touch it. Conservation status? I asked. Yeah. It's a formality. Fill out the papers, get a site visit, maybe install a buffer zone. After that, it's protected land. It was perfect. Karen wanted control. I'd give her permanence instead. I filed the paperwork immediately. The process took a month, inspections, soil samples, wildlife logs, but by December, it was official. The pond became part of the County Wetland Preservation Register. When the notice went public, I nearly felt bad for her. The HOA's authority over my property was nullified. They couldn't mow, inspect, fine, or regulate anything within the buffer zone. My pond now existed beyond their reach. Karen lost it completely. She stormed into the next HOA meeting waving the county letter, screaming that it was fraudulent. Greg calmly read the document aloud. The Maple Creek wetland area is hereby designated as a protected environmental site. Then he added, and as such, exempt from all HOA ordinances. The room fell silent except for her voice rising like feedback. He tricked us. He's mocking our authority, she yelled. But no one jumped to her defense. People were tired. Even her closest allies had seen too many headlines, too many apologies, too many disasters. When she realized the room wasn't with her, she threw the papers onto the table and stormed out. Her husband followed quietly, closing the door behind them. Outside, I watched from my porch as she stood under a flickering streetlight, gripping her umbrella like a weapon. For a second, I saw the person beneath all that control, the fear, the desperation to matter. She wasn't just fighting me, she was fighting irrelevance. A week later, she put her house up for sale. It didn't move quickly. Realtors whispered about drainage issues. Potential buyers saw the pond's protective signs and hesitated. Winter came, and her for sale banner sagged under frost. Sometimes, at dusk, I'd see her standing by the yard's edge, staring at the water she'd once tried to erase. The pond looked beautiful that season, icy edges shimmering under the pale sun, ducks cutting through silver reflections. It was quiet, peaceful, eternal. And for the first time since the war began, the reflection didn't show conflict. It showed closure. For a few weeks after Karen's for sale sign went up, the neighborhood exhaled. The air felt lighter, the gossip slower, even the geese on the pond seemed less aggressive. People started waving again. Greg came by once to ask about fishing rights for his grandson, and Tyler joked about renaming the place Lake Freedom. It was as close to normal as Maple Creek Estates had been in years. But peace in an HOA is like frost. It never lasts under pressure. One gray morning, a black SUV pulled into Karen's driveway. Out stepped a man in a sharp suit, clipboard in hand, wearing an expression that screamed, audit. He stayed for an hour, pacing, measuring, snapping photos. When he left, he tacked a notice to her door, foreclosure inspection in progress. Rumors exploded before noon. Some said she'd defaulted on fines, others whispered about misused HOA funds. I didn't want to care, but schadenfreude has a gravitational pull. Tyler texted, "You seeing this?" I replied, trying not to. That evening, I saw her lights flick on for the first time in days. Karen was still there, defiant, perhaps desperate. She stood in the window talking on the phone, pacing like a caged animal. At one point, she slammed her fist on the counter hard enough that I heard the echo through the still night. The next day, I got my own letter. This one from the HOA again. It said the board would be transitioning leadership due to administrative restructuring. Translation: Karen had been removed as president. Greg was now interim chair. He sounded apologetic when he called. "We're trying to reset things," he said. "Make peace." Peace sounded good. But nothing about Karen was finished. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of running water, not from the pond, but from somewhere closer. I stepped outside and caught the glint of a garden hose snaking across the grass, disappearing under the fence toward my property line. I followed the sound until I found the source. Karen, half hidden behind her hydrangeas, holding the hose, spraying it into my drainage trench. "Karen," I said, voice calm but shaking. "What are you doing?" She startled, then straightened with that familiar, self-righteous fury. "You ruined my life," she hissed. "My basement, my reputation, my position, everything." "That was your doing," I said. "You could have stopped months ago." Her eyes flashed. "No. You took control from me. You embarrassed me." She let go of the hose, letting it spill over the grass like a wounded snake. "Now I'm taking something back." I turned off the water and left her standing there in the moonlight. Part of me wanted to call the police. The other part pitied her too much. A dethroned tyrant still clings to the illusion of control. It was sad more than threatening. The next morning, Greg knocked on my door again. He'd already heard. Karen had flooded her own yard overnight trying to prove my pond caused structural damage. The police had visited after a noise complaint, found the hose, and filed a report. "She's unraveling," Greg said quietly. "We're doing damage control." The HOA officially suspended her membership that week, something I didn't even know was possible. She wasn't banned from living there, but she lost all voting rights, privileges, and access to community funds. Greg called it administrative quarantine. I called it poetic justice. Then came the storm. Not metaphorical, an actual storm, the kind that turns driveways into rivers and gutters into waterfalls. It started on a Friday night and didn't stop for 36 hours. The pond rose, but my new drainage system held firm. Karen's property, however, sat in a shallow bowl of land. I watched from my porch as water pooled across her yard, climbing higher by the hour. By Saturday evening, she was outside in a raincoat, frantically digging trenches with a garden spade. The wind howled, whipping her hair across her face. I almost offered to help, but then I saw what she was doing, redirecting water toward the slope dividing our properties. It wasn't enough to harm my pond, but it showed intent. Even drowning, she couldn't stop trying to control where the water went. Sunday morning, the storm broke. Sunlight poured through clouds like a benediction, and the neighborhood emerged to assess the damage. Fallen branches, flooded gardens, one crushed mailbox. Karen's basement window had cracked under pressure. You could smell mildew from the sidewalk. County trucks rolled in by noon, checking for flood risk. One of the inspectors, the same man from months ago, spotted me and grinned. "Guess your pond held up," he said. I nodded. He frowned toward Karen's property. "Not so lucky next door." She stood in her yard, mud streaked on her coat, watching them measure the damage. When she saw me, her expression didn't contain hatred anymore, just exhaustion. She mouthed something I couldn't hear. Then she went inside and closed the door. 2 days later, her house was empty. Movers came quietly, packing boxes under her supervision. No goodbye, no confrontation, no final words. By evening, the house stood hollow, blinds drawn. I thought that was the end. But Maple Creek had a way of turning endings into sequels. 3 weeks later, I received another certified envelope. This time not from Karen, but from the HOA's insurance division. It informed me that the association was filing a collective liability claim against its former president for damages resulting from misuse of community funds and environmental negligence. Apparently, she'd spent thousands from the HOA's account on legal fees, inspection equipment, and safety outreach materials during her pond crusade. The board wanted restitution. Her name became legend overnight. "Did you hear about Karen's audit?" people whispered at the coffee shop. "Apparently she bought herself a generator with HOA money." Someone else added, "And a pressure washer." Claimed it was for algae control. The scandal revitalized the community in a strange way. Suddenly, everyone wanted transparency. New committees formed: finance oversight, neighborhood restoration, wildlife support. My pond, once a symbol of defiance, became the centerpiece of the HOA's rebranding campaign. Greg even asked permission to feature it in the upcoming newsletter. They held the winter festival by the water that year. Kids built small snowmen along the bank. Someone hung twinkling lights in the trees. I served hot chocolate while people complimented how peaceful the pond looked. The irony tasted sweet. But deep down, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Karen wasn't the type to vanish quietly. The foreclosure notice had disappeared from her door, and no one knew where she'd gone. Rumors said she'd moved in with family up north. Tyler joked she'd joined a different HOA to start fresh. I almost believed it. Then, one morning in early spring, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. My pond at sunrise, taken from the hill behind the old clubhouse. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were 3 words: "Still watching you." I stared at it for a long time. The handwriting was hers, unmistakable. I should have been angry or scared, but mostly I just felt tired. I tucked the photo into the pond archive under a new tab labeled Aftermath. Weeks passed. Nothing else came. Maybe she'd mailed it before leaving town. Maybe it was her way of saying goodbye in the only language she knew: control. The HOA moved on. Greg officially turned the leadership role over to a new president, a mild, kind woman named Joyce who preferred planting tulips to writing bylaws. She stopped by with cookies and said, "We'd love to make your pond the backdrop for the community calendar." I agreed on one condition: no reflection clause. She laughed, confused but polite. By summer, the neighborhood had fully rebranded itself. The sign at the entrance now read "Welcome to Maple Creek, where nature meets home." They even installed a little plaque near the waterline: "Protected wetland, please respect wildlife." Sometimes visitors assumed it was a public park. I didn't correct them. Every now and then, I'd see something small: a shadow near the old property line, a car that idled too long, a shape in the reflection that looked like someone standing on the far bank. But I stopped checking. Some ghosts fade only when you stop giving them audience. Karen's house eventually sold to a retired couple from out of state. They planted azaleas, painted the shutters blue, and waved every morning. No more clipboards. No more fines. Just peace. One evening near midsummer, I sat on the porch with Tyler watching the sunset shimmer across the pond. "Hard to believe this used to be a battleground," he said. "War always leaves good soil," I replied. He raised an eyebrow. "You're turning poetic now." "Maybe," I said, smiling faintly. "Or maybe I just like the view." The water rippled with wind, catching the orange light like liquid gold. Somewhere across the neighborhood, a door closed softly, the sound of ordinary life reclaiming the space that conflict had once devoured. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't since before the first orange notice appeared on my mailbox: genuine stillness. Not the kind that comes from victory, but the kind that follows a long storm finally running out of rain. Spring melted into summer with the kind of quiet that made me uneasy. After years of constant conflict, the silence itself felt suspicious, like the world was holding its breath. The HOA had stabilized under Joyce, the new president who wore gardening gloves instead of wielding a clipboard. She organized flower swaps and composting days, not compliance patrols. People actually smiled at meetings. You'd think I would have been happy. But after everything that happened, I'd learned that calm rarely meant the story was over. The pond had settled into something beautiful. Dragonflies skimmed the surface. Cattails swayed in warm wind. Even the frogs had returned after the chlorine incident. The county had finished installing a discreet, protected wetland post near the property line. It felt permanent now, a living, breathing reminder that persistence sometimes wins over power. Then, one Friday morning, a white envelope appeared on my porch. No stamp. No handwriting. Just my name printed neatly on a label. Inside was a folded legal document and a single sheet of paper with 5 words scrawled in blue ink. You took everything from me. The legal document was a notice of appeal, an attempt to challenge the county's wetland designation. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Karen Holt, former HOA president. She had found a lawyer willing to file a petition claiming the county's process was procedurally invalid. It shouldn't have rattled me. She was out of state, probably desperate, but old habits die hard. For a few minutes, standing there in the sunlight, I felt the old unease return like static before a storm. I took the notice straight to the county office. The clerk read it and sighed. "We've seen this before," she said. "Technically anyone can file an appeal, but this won't go far. The designation's airtight." She stamped the document received and acknowledged and handed me a copy. "We'll notify you if it advances." For a while I tried to ignore it. But the strange little incident started again. Footprints near the fence after rain, the motion light flickering on at odd hours, a faint chemical smell one evening by the pond that faded before I could trace it. Tyler said I was paranoid. Maybe I was. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done. A week later, I found proof. The camera by the tool shed caught a figure at midnight, female, hooded, moving carefully along the fence line. She crouched near the water, pouring something from a small canister, then hurried back to the road. The face was only visible for a second as she glanced up at the infrared light, older, thinner, but unmistakably her. I called the county environmental line again. This time they didn't send an inspector, they sent 2. The samples they took showed traces of herbicide, the kind used for lawn control. It wasn't lethal to animals, but it could have stripped the vegetation bare if left unchecked. "Persistent pattern of interference," one inspector muttered. "We'll escalate." They opened a formal investigation, forwarding the footage to local law enforcement. Karen was officially banned from the neighborhood within a week. Trespassing order, filed and approved. Greg texted me the next day. "Guess she really couldn't let it go." I replied, "Control doesn't die, it just relocates." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the war wasn't quite finished until I closed it myself. So I decided to meet it head-on, but on my terms. I wrote a letter, not a threat, not an insult, just a statement. "Karen, the pond is still here. The reflection hasn't changed, even after everything. Maybe it never will. You can keep fighting the water, but you'll only drown yourself in it." I didn't mail it. I left it on the porch one evening, addressed to nowhere, and watched the wind carry it away the next morning. Sometimes closure isn't about being heard. It's about saying what you need to yourself. The investigation wrapped quickly. The county issued a permanent environmental protection order around the pond, citing ongoing harassment attempts. They even installed a small monitoring post by the roadside. It was more attention than I'd ever wanted, but it made the finality undeniable. 2 months later, I got the news through an email from Greg. "You might want to sit down for this." Attached was a newspaper clipping. Former HOA president charged in fraud scheme. Karen had apparently been managing another neighborhood's HOA in a nearby county under her sister's name, skimming funds through fake maintenance contracts. She'd been caught when the county cross-referenced her old Maple Creek records during an unrelated audit. The image accompanying the story showed her in handcuffs, head down, hair streaked with gray. I didn't feel joy reading it, just an odd emptiness. Like watching the final scene of a play you'd rehearsed too long. She wasn't the monster people thought. She was just addicted to control until it consumed her. The neighborhood took it as a sign of rebirth. Joyce hosted a gathering that weekend by the pond, a community renewal celebration, complete with food trucks, lanterns, and music. Families spread blankets along the shore. Kids tossed breadcrumbs to ducks. Greg brought his guitar, and Tyler grilled under a string of lights that reflected beautifully off the water. As the night deepened, the pond shimmered like glass. The lights, the laughter, the air all felt different, lighter, more human. Joyce stood to make a small speech. "This community has been through conflict," she said. "But sometimes conflict teaches us what matters. Cooperation, respect, and, apparently, good drainage systems." The crowd laughed. I smiled quietly, realizing how surreal it was to hear people clapping where once there had been shouting. When the last of the music faded, I stayed behind by the water. The moon was high, silver ripples bending the reflection of the houses along the bank. Somewhere out there, I imagined Karen sitting alone in a rented room, reading about the very place she'd tried to dominate. Maybe part of her even missed it. Tyler joined me, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "So," he said, "does this mean the legend's over?" I looked out across the water. "Legends never really end," I said. "They just stop needing new chapters." He chuckled. "You ever gonna tell the internet this story? Reddit would eat it up." "Maybe," I said. "But they'd never believe half of it." He left after a while, and I lingered, watching the reflection until the lights dimmed and the surface stilled completely. For the first time, the pond didn't remind me of a battlefield, it reminded me of balance. The thing Karen had fought hardest to destroy had become the proof that chaos could heal. A week later, the county sent a final confirmation letter: wetland classification permanent. No further appeals permitted. I pinned it to the bulletin board above my desk. That same morning, I noticed something new near the far edge of the water, a small patch of lilies blooming where the chlorine had once scorched the soil. I walked down to the shore, knelt, and ran my fingers through the cool water. It was clear, calm, alive. Above me, birds cut through the sky, their reflections rippling in distorted harmony. I heard a car stop briefly on the road behind me, and turned just in time to see an unfamiliar vehicle pause at the old Holt property. The window rolled down, but I couldn't see the driver's face, just a pale hand resting on the steering wheel before the car rolled away. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, it didn't matter. The pond wasn't hers anymore. It never had been. By late summer, the HOA newsletter printed a feature article titled "From Conflict to Conservation: The Pond That United Maple Creek." Joyce had written it herself, framing the whole saga as a parable of perseverance. They even used an aerial photo showing the pond glinting like a coin under the sun. She sent me a copy with a note: "I think you'll like how it ends." I read the final paragraph out loud to myself. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive when the loudest voice wins, it arrives when the quiet one refuses to disappear. I folded the newsletter and placed it in the pond archive. That binder, once born out of defense, had become a record of transformation. Every notice, every photo, every absurd rule that led to something unexpectedly beautiful. As evening settled, I poured a glass of iced tea and sat on the porch. The light softened across the water, painting everything gold. A pair of ducks glided past, leaving trails that intertwined like signatures. Somewhere across the neighborhood, a mower hummed, a screen door slammed, a child laughed. Ordinary sounds. The kind that mean peace has taken root. I thought back to that first morning, Karen in her yellow blazer, pointing at the water and demanding I drain it. If she could see it now, lush and thriving, she'd probably call it non-compliant again. I smiled at the memory. The reflection on the pond shimmered slightly, showing my house, the trees, and the sign that read protected habitat. And for a second, I thought I saw another reflection beside mine, faint like a shadow leaning over the water. But when I looked up, there was no one there. Just the wind, moving softly through the reeds. I raised my glass toward the pond in a silent toast. To reflections, I murmured. And to leaving them where they belong. The ripples widened, catching the last of the sun, and the pond swallowed the light whole, calm, endless, and finally, utterly free.